Teresa has mastered the history of model making, participated as a curator in an exhibition on the history of models that she'll describe to us that was held in Frankfurt at the Deutsche Architektur Museum. And so because we're starting late, and I really apologize to Teresa as well as to our audience, I will get out of the way as quickly as possible. And I know we have with us tonight a very expert audience of people who are architectural historians and architects who will have questions that you would want to pose to our speaker. And if you offer those questions in the chat box, and I will be able to moderate them. As I leave the screen now, I'm going to invite Teresa to turn her camera on. We'll stop my screen sharing and we will then launch into her talk. Teresa, please take over now.
Thank you, Carol. Good evening, everyone. I'm extremely excited to be here tonight and to share with you a book that I have been working on for almost 10 years. The book is called The Architectural Models of Theodore Conrad, and it has the somewhat cryptic subtitle, The Miniature Boom of Mid-Century Modernism. I'm even more excited for this particular talk here at the Skyscraper Museum because New York and Jersey City were Conrad's home and also the place where he founded and operated his model-making practice. New York's also the place where some of his most high-profile buildings were created, and I'm quite certain that he personally would have been very pleased to see his models getting this kind of attention almost 100 years after he first started out in his hometown of Jersey City. For this reason, I want to do a somewhat different talk from what I would normally do, because I think you, as the audience based in New York, knows the city's architecture very well. So I will take you on a very short tour through the research that went into making the book, and then I will take you on a tour through Ted Conrad's New York between the 1920s and the 1970s, including many buildings that I'm sure you are very familiar with. But first, let me give you a short introduction. Oops, sorry. In 1956, journalist John Havis wrote about Ted Conrad. Ted Conrad has probably built more New York real estate than anyone else, in miniature that is. And 25 years later, another journalist called Anna Quindlen doubled down on this statement saying, Nelson Rockefeller sent visitors to see the view from his window. Doris Duke argued over doorways. And Jackie Kennedy first saw what President Kennedy's grave would look like from a Conrad model. Much happened since architectural model maker Theodore Conrad founded his modeling studio in Jersey City in 1931 at the age of 21, and these newspaper reports. I'm showing you here a view from Conrad's window, the one that was mentioned in the quote we just read. The first image on the left was taken sometime in the 1930s, and the image on the right was taken in 2013. As you can see from this somewhat blurry picture on the left, New York changed quite a bit. From a city that had a cluster of high-rises in Lower Manhattan in the 30s, which was accompanied by the occasional dot for other tall buildings such as the Empire State Building, the Metropolitan Life Tower, or Rockefeller Center, to the walls that you see on the right, the walls of skyscrapers that we all know so well. The decades immediately following World War II was when many of the changes in New York's architecture began. They were also the time of Theodore Conrad's professional prime, and when he was widely known for his meticulous architectural models that were made with a high degree of detail and using cutting-edge materials such as acrylic glass or aluminum. If you are among the people who have never heard of Theodore Conrad, however, you are not alone. Despite his prolific career and renown during his lifetime, his body of work was almost forgotten when I started researching for the book. And there are some very notable exceptions of people who were aware of his work, even then. The first time I learned of Conrad's name was almost by coincidence. In 2011, I was part of a team that created a large exhibition on surveying 20th century architectural models at the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt. The show was called The Architectural Models, Tool, Fetish, Small Utopia. And one of the objects we had selected was a model of Lever House that came from the collection of MoMA. The aim of the show and the book were to tell the story behind the objects and their making. And as I started looking for the origin of the model of Lever House in preparation of this show, Ted Conrad quickly emerged as a central figure of interest. MoMA did provide initial information, which was a very good start, but not sufficient to learn the story behind the model. Our own research led us to Conrad's family, who still lives in Jersey City, and we eventually received a folder of Xerox copies of Conrad's life's work that he had prepared himself. And it included newspaper clippings, photos, and letters that he had written, and he had sent to a relative who lived in a suburb of Frankfurt by coincidence. In a phone call shortly after that, Conrad's daughter, Doris Conrad Brown, told me that she still kept dozens of models, folders, drawings, and photos in her father's old workshop. We included as much of what we could in the model show at the museum in Frankfurt, but it quickly became obvious that another project was necessary to dig deeper and uncover the whole truly fascinating story, not just behind Lever House, but behind Conrad's work. And that's what I did between 2013 and 2016 as part of a PhD, looking at his work and also looking at model making in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And that's the story that the book tells that we're talking about today. In 2013, so a year after the show in Frankfurt, I finally went to Jersey City for the first time and found an entire row of basement rooms that was filled with Conrad's legacy that seemed like it hadn't been touched in 2 decades. There were models and model pieces, photos, drawings, business files, letters, and even a small number of tools, which also seemed to have not been moved since Conrad died in 1994. Over the course of several weeks and subsequent trips in the following years, I charted a course through these decades worth of material that his family had preserved very well, trying to identify key projects of his career, documenting his modeling skills and his studio practice, as well as creating a very basic documentation of everything I found. And today this list includes at least 2,900 entries, and there are still many projects that are unaccounted for or unidentified to this day. It wasn't just Conrad's work that was documented in this archive, but that of many others, of employees, collaborators, and even some competitors who were equally prominently featured. Among the collaborators, the most prominent one is the model photographer Louis Checkman, who was the closest and arguably the most influential of Conrad's collaborators. And it's an absolute shame that his name didn't make it onto the title of the book, because if it hadn't been for Louis Checkman, nothing that we found in the archive would have been preserved, because most of it was photos. As a duo, Ted Conrad and Louis Checkman were, in my view, 2 of the most influential inventors in the way that modern architecture evolved in New York and how it was disseminated in the United States after the war, not just within architectural circles, but much more importantly, to a much wider audience. Ted Conrad, who you see on the left here, was born in Jersey City, where he spent most of his life. He was born in 1910 to a family of German immigrants, and he attended Pratt in Brooklyn in the late 20s. The school then followed the very common Beaux-Arts system of education, which was based heavily on rendering and copying of traditional architectural styles that were fashionable in the 19th and early 20th century. Conrad left school in the summer of 1931, not a good time to leave school because of the Depression, but he immediately opened his modeling studio in Jersey City. 30 years later, in 1962, Ted Conrad was the only model maker who ever received the American Institute of Architects Craftsmanship Medal for a lifetime achievement with architectural models. Louis Checkman on the right was less well-known but no less influential. He was a childhood friend of Conrad's who grew up on the same street and started model making together with him. He eventually became a photographer and graduated from the New York School of Modern Photography and developed a style of model photography based on realism and detail-oriented depictions of models that was ubiquitous in magazines from the 1930s onward, and that contributed widely to the acceptance of modern architecture. There's another very important person for this research, and that is Jane Jacobs. One of the texts you come across very early on when you start looking into how others have described American mid-century model making You're looking at Jane Jacobs' 1958 report on model making in New York called The Miniature Boom. The text was written for the Architectural Forum, and in this report, she summed up a development that started sometime in the 1920s and that had led to a steep increase in models after the war. She described how these models were using new materials, new techniques to fabricate those materials, and how they were made by large numbers of model makers that hadn't existed until after World War II. With her title of this text, she also gave my research its original name, The Miniature Boom. As one of the epicenters of this boom, if you will, New York was where most of these new modeling techniques and materials led to changes in the representational qualities of models that were adopted globally after World War II. It was especially models made for public use and not for design that proved to have a wide-ranging influence. And that was, when I started out, something that very few people were looking at. Because the focus in model research usually lies in how design practices use models, rather than the wider context of models in society. Aside from her article, there wasn't all that much out there that explained the origins of this so-called miniature boom. And this is what the book looks into. Why were there so many models made after World War II? Why was it so remarkable that the Architectural Forum felt like they had to report on it? Who were these model makers and where did they come from? What was new about the way they made models? And was the miniature boom really such a sudden and random occurrence that sprung up after World War II? These were some of the questions I asked myself as I was going through the archive in Jersey City. And to find answers, I followed what seemed to me the most important strands of evolution that happened sometime between the 1920s and 30s, and that all seemed to converge early in the 1950s. These developments are, first, the development and use of new modeling materials, so from cardboard, wood, clay, and plaster, to plastics such as acrylic glass and aluminum. The second change was a change in the way that architecture was created because of an increasing split between experts working together in and outside of architectural offices. And that included architects, professional renderers, photographers, and model makers, and many others. And lastly, it also includes a shift in the methods by which architecture was created. So away from drawing toward three-dimensional tools in photography, both for the design and also the public presentation of ideas. And this is something I ended up calling a three-dimensional shift, so borrowing from the ideas that there are technological shifts over time, such as the current digital term that we're talking about a lot. To illustrate some of the findings, I want to take you on a short tour through Ted Conrad's New York and tell you the story of the miniature boom as we stop along the way and look at some of the buildings that Conrad modeled and helped into existence. We will start in Madison Square Park on the corner of Madison Avenue and 24th Street. The building you see in the pictures is the northern annex to the Metropolitan Life Building, which would have been arguably New York's first glass skyscraper with a planned height of 120 stories and a wild expressionist glass facade that you can see in the third picture from the left. The addition was planned by Harvey Wiley Corbett's office in 1929, where Conrad interned as a model maker while he was still an architecture student at Pratt. Conrad himself had been interested in model making since his high school days, and he chose Corbett's office because of his well-known interest in cutting-edge modeling techniques. This internship would turn out to be the ticket that gave Conrad access to many of the architects and clients that he would work with for the rest of his life. He met Wallace Harrison, who at the time was Corbett's junior partner, and who would become one of the biggest modern architects in the US after World War II. He also met Edward Durrell Stone, another big name who is now mostly associated with a more ornamental modernism, and who was a young draftsman in Corbett's office at the time. And Stone is also important because he later introduced Conrad to Gordon Bunshaft, the chief designer of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. The models for the Metropolitan Life Building that you see here are among the earliest known by Conrad that have survived, some of them. They were built using Corbett's technique of folded cardboard models that had their facades painted on the exterior. This was a common way of model building in the 1920s, using simple hand tools, as you can see here. It was a relatively fast and cheap way of making small objects to test how a building's exterior would look and how its mass would fit into the urban fabric. Fitting into the urban fabric was an important aspect of planning since the introduction of the New York zoning law in 1916 that required setbacks for high towers and regulated the way that architectural mass had to be managed by the designer. Corbett had prepared a design guideline together with the architectural renderer Hugh Ferris that illustrated this way of working a few years before the design of the MetLife Tower. And you can see here a progression of how you would design using the New York zoning law. So you start at the top left with the largest permissible mass under the law, and then you start shaping it into an actual design. Models were congenial to this way of designing. And I'm going back for a second. The building of the MetLife Tower was ultimately only built as a stump, as the cardboard models could not convince the board that such a glass building was feasible, and the beginning depression made any adventurous construction project a liability. We will head up to Midtown, where there are several examples of how model makers worked before the 1930s. These models were not made by Conrad, though he was definitely involved in making models for Rockefeller Center, but they were made by another model maker called René Paul Chamberlain. The models for Rockefeller Center or the Daily News Building are an illustration of how this way of designing according to the New York zoning law worked, by sculpting a raw mass of the building and then creating a step design. These models were made in modeling clay and later cast in plaster, and they allowed the model makers, and in some cases the architect, to cut away mass to fit the tower into the permissible dimensions. Modeling clay was, just like cardboard, another very popular modeling material in the 1920s. We will stay in Midtown and look at the Rockefeller apartment model, which was designed by Wallace Harrison after his split from Corbett and is a few blocks north of Rockefeller Center on 54th. Conrad had used another common material at the time and made a wooden model for the apartments. And you can see here that there's a model that has a white foundation onto which later windows were painted. As with all the models we've seen so far, it was the treatment of the exterior of models that was a main focus of model making. It was done mostly by painting onto the model directly or pasting painted paper, or as in the case of the plaster and clay models, etching it into the facade. On the lot across the street facing 53rd Street, the Museum of Modern Art was being planned in the second half of the 30s. Conrad built the model again and used a new technique here, using small vinyl pieces to assemble a marble facade so as to imitate the veins of the marble more realistically than had been previously possible. As part of this new process of assembling a model from individual pieces, I'm showing you here a somewhat new tool that came up in the 1930s, and that is model drawings. These have become necessary to allow the model maker to plan the assembly of individual pieces in advance. These construction manuals for the assembly of models were a departure from the earlier models that were often made of a drawing that was then folded and became the model itself. There are very few model drawings surviving because they're normally used up, but in Conrad's case, there's a spectacular number of drawings that survive from the 1930s, and this is just an example. Next, we're crossing the East River and heading out to Flushing, Queens. The 1930s were a difficult time for many in the building industry in New York because of the Depression. The World's Fair was meant as a way to lift people's spirits and to provide opportunities for economic recovery. For model makers and architects, the fair was a very important employer and an opportunity that introduced many unemployed architects to model making as a career. There's two different stories about the inception of the 1939 New York World's Fair. The first is the official one that follows the account of Grover Whalen, who was the World's Fair Corporation's president. In this story, it was him and a few businessmen who got together in 1934 and followed the example of the Chicago World's Fair to provide economic relief for New York. More interesting for model making, the second story credits Edward Roosevelt, who was a distant cousin of the president, who, together with a Belgian-American engineer called Joseph Schacten, allegedly pitched the idea of a fair to an editorial writer at the Herald Tribune in order to convince them to put on a fair. According to this version, it was Conrad who made the first models representing the ideal for a fair. Even more so, Conrad was supposedly promised to become head model maker of the fair, which might have caused him to enlarge his workshop and move to a new location in Jersey City. The promise never materialized, and Mr. Shackton was let off in 1937 and eventually sued the World's Fair Corporation for plagiarism. Even though Conrad did not become the head model maker, he built a number of high-profile models for it. And I'm just showing you here a couple of examples of models that he built. But there's one in particular that proved to be important, and that is the model of the Pittsburgh House of Glass. As the treatment of the facades had been one of the main tasks of model makers in the 20s and 30s, the increasing use of glass for modern design became a problem because of the existing modeling materials that could not represent transparency. Many of the design models for the New York World's Fair illustrate the problem very well. They either use opaque materials like cardboard or wood, or they use celluloid, which was semi-transparent but couldn't display any large surfaces without warping, as you can see in the model on the bottom. Plexiglass had come out in 1936, and model makers had started to experiment with it in a search or an attempt at searching for a solution for the problem of transparency. The first documented time that Conrad used large quantities of plexiglass was for the Pittsburgh House of Glass. And this achieved an unprecedented level of translucence and reflections of light in model photos that would become the norm for photos and model making in the 1950s. The photos you see here were taken by Louis Checkman, and they achieved very low vantage points and very tight frames that were of equal importance as they were a very early example of realism in model photography that was used in lifestyle magazines such as Life or Women's Home Companion, but later returned to architectural circles in magazines such as the Architectural Forum. Before we return back to the city, we will make another stop in the suburbs in Mount Kisco, New York. Here you see a house designed by Edward Durrell Stone, which was planned as a single-family home for the Liebmans, who were a wealthy couple from New York and among the patrons of the Museum of Modern Art. In the 30s and 40s, it was especially these small homes, which were similar to the Pittsburgh House of Glass in many aspects, and these homes became a vehicle for innovation for architectural model makers and photographers. Because unlike the earlier models, these house models turned into assembled miniatures that were made both using hand and power tools in large-scale workshops. And I'm just showing you here examples for that. These new models were no longer folded three-dimensional drawings, but they consisted of hundreds, if not thousands, of individual pieces that were prefabricated and then put together. Using new plastics and aluminum in addition to the older modeling materials used meant an increase in realism in the objects made. It meant larger sizes and increased details that could withstand the critical gaze of a camera. Many of these house models were created without a client or site in mind, and they were used to take photos with them that were published in women's and lifestyle magazines to sell floor plans to prospective homeowners and sell them modern designs, you could add. The color photos taken by photographers such as Louis Checkman, were of an almost dollhouse-like love of detail, and they included the newly available allure of color photography that could showcase the model's great detail to their audience. The war, and that's when we're heading back to Manhattan slowly, the war meant that most civilian construction was halted. Conrad was one of very few model makers who was able to avoid the draft. And until 1945, he worked on assignments for various branches of the military to make models of planes, as you can see on the top left, or the obscurement of industrial areas that were important for the war effort, such as the Wright plant in Paterson that made airplane engines, or, as you can see on the top right, new constructions such as the asphalt plant by Kahn and Jacobs on East River Drive. Heading back to Midtown, there's another building by Kahn and Jacobs, which was one of the first glass high-rises that was built after the war. 100 Park Avenue. It was designed using the familiar wedding cake shape based on the New York zoning law. And the tower has a glass facade, which was a novelty after the war. The model, however, was built very traditionally using these glued-on opaque windows that we've seen before. A few blocks north on Park Avenue, and a few years later, Conrad built the model of Lever House, which I had showed you at the beginning of this talk. And this was built using a completely unprecedented method. It shows SOM's innovative curtain wall slab that adapted to the zoning law by building a slender tower on a small portion of the site, and thus leaving airspace above the empty base. And it's built in the model using plexiglass. Though the curtain wall is only a slim, non-load-bearing wall in the building, in the model, the plexiglass is load-bearing. It represents the glass, yet it does much more. It supports the entire model, and it was the first time that a model realistically represented glass in tall buildings to a degree of detail that was previously impossible. Even though materials such as plexiglass had been introduced for their representative properties, so its transparency chiefly, it quickly became a staple of the modeler's toolkit because of its sturdiness that made it useful for mass models and design models, as well as detailed presentation models. Lever House was also one of the early models that used realistic model photography to plan the way the design would fit into the urban fabric by envisioning the perspective of a pedestrian, as you can see here in Ezra Stoller's model photos on the left, and then the pictures of the final building that are quite famous. The larger and more detailed models of plastic and aluminum allowed for new kinds of models that increasingly drew the view of the model of the visitor into the interior of the model. And they were also increasingly used for design purposes in large offices and with clients such as boards of directors who were involved in decisions from individual floor plans to the material of the facade of a building. Corner sections like these were one such tool. Another tool were floor plan models. You see Gordon Bunchaft here explaining the Connecticut General Life design to the board of directors. And as a result of the visible interiors through the large windows, the miniatures needed to be furnished realistically. I'm showing you here the model of the Manufacturers Trust Building on Fifth Avenue, which is an early example, and that featured not just paintings on the wall, but also the signature wall door that you can still see today. The models became veritable miniature buildings that included lighting, which could simulate what a building would look like during the day and at night, as in the case of the Pepsi-Cola building or the Union Carbide building. And the inclusion of lighting fixtures then necessitated the addition of air conditioning and switches to turn off the light to keep the plexiglass from overheating. In the case of the Pepsi-Cola building that you see here, this ultimately led to the demise of the model. The timer broke, and then one night the light turned on and the model burned down. The increased detail and realistic representation of building materials also led to color model photos that help review the lighting or materials of models. One example that I know Carol knows very well is the Chase Manhattan Bank in Lower Manhattan. Aside from the use of models for design reviews, the photos of models then became the official preview of buildings in newspapers, architectural magazines, and leaflets, as in the case of the Gallery of Modern Art in Columbus Circle. Models had seen a tremendous increase in popularity since the 1920s and 30s because of exhibits, not just large public spectacles such as the World's Fair, which you see on the left, but also as part of the many modeling societies that were founded during this time, as well as many new museums and types of exhibitions that included models and dioramas in their displays. And I'm just showing a selection of these kinds of exhibitions here. The new large models of the post-war era lent themselves to taking the audience's interest in 3D objects into the boardrooms for design approval, as here in the case of the Equitable Life building, or to the construction site as a preview of the building And these models helped decision-making processes, but also predicted the urban transformation for the public. And this is the model of the Seagram Building that was mentioned in the beginning. Conrad retired in 1982, but kept his shop open until 1994. From the 70s onward, his services were still sought after, albeit on a smaller scale. There were several reasons that led to a decline in model making that were directly linked to the architectural network that Conrad was a part of. The oil crises of the 1970s again caused a severe slump in construction that affected architects and all other connected professions. On a more personal level, the height of the post-war boom was closely tied to the generation of architectural professionals who had grown up in the first half of the century and experienced the peak of their careers in the 1950s and 60s. By the late 60s, the father figures of the modern movement had all died. Le Corbusier in 1965, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and Walter Gropius in 1969. Many of Conrad's close professional relationships were coming to an end a decade later, as Edward Wells Stone died in 1978, Wallace Harrison 3 years later, and Gordon Bunshaft retired in the 80s. International style architecture, and with it the intricate models of glass facades, had become increasingly criticized by a younger generation of architects, who accused modernism as a whole for many of the city's post-war planning failures. And I'm just showing you here the Crown Hall model as the sinking Titanic, which was an expression of that accusation. Conrad was aware of the changing times and how models may have contributed to the fatigue toward modernism when he said, "I must say I revolutionized model making so you could see how good a building looked. My complaint now is that clients look at the model and nobody studies it, and the architects sell the job, good or bad. I think we've gotten worse architecture along with this wonderful tool." Not all of Conrad's models were successful, and before I close, I just want to show you two of the cases where his models weren't successful in New York. The first one is the design by Edward Wells Stone of the New York Civic Center that was planned for City Hall Park on Chambers Street, which would have replaced the older building that is still standing there. And the other one is the Lower Manhattan model that includes plans such as the unbuilt West Side Depressed Highway and the Lower Manhattan Expressway by Robert Moses. I'm also choosing this one to close with because this model coincidentally was displayed at the Skyscraper Museum in 1998 in the first ever exhibition there. So in some ways, I think it ties it up pretty nicely. The book finally is a first attempt at writing the history of the miniature boom, from its beginnings in the 1920s to the slow fade out in the 1970s. It is the first look at the work of an architectural model maker from a very broad, so spanning many decades, but also very detailed perspective. Despite its title, it is not a biography of Theodore Conrad, but a report on how model making and photography were part of the tremendous changes that led to modern architecture becoming a new architectural standard in the Western world after World War II. It looks at how the tools that all those involved in making architecture use in their everyday lives, and how they shape the way they think and design. It looks at three-dimensionality as a key aspect of architectural thinking, one which arguably we've seen take over once more with computer modeling, which arguably has become the main medium of expression in architecture today. And it looks at how wider discussion about good design and craftsmanship is influenced by the representations with which we choose to argue, which I think is another very current topic, considering that many of us spend our days inundated by news alerts from platforms such as ArcDaily or Instagram, which over time shape our tastes and expectations of what quote unquote good architecture is or should be. Many of the images and drawings I showed here today are in the book, and they're published for the first time because this archive has never been digitized before. The book includes 5 chapters centering around these new innovations and moving from making to seeing to displaying, so from model making as a profession to modeling materials to drawings to photography and ultimately to the display of models in public exhibitions or private meetings. And with that, I want to end my talk, and I want to give you the opportunity to comment or ask questions. Thank you.
Teresa, thank you so much for that wonderful tour of New York as seen through the studio of Ted Conrad. We do have, there was one like heads up hello, excuse me, from Cynthia Sanford, who said she's the next door neighbor of Ted Conrad studio, and was very excited to be able to see your talk tonight. And I know that you have other people that you have worked with in salvaging the archive and introducing the archive. And I wanted to mention that I saw Janet Park's name among the list of participants. So of course, the now retired curator from Avery Library, Fine Arts and Architecture Library. Could you talk, and it looks like Janet has just said hello to everyone, and I hope she'll pose some additional questions, but could you talk a little bit about the archive and how it has landed at Avery and the kind of scope of it and some of the process? Maybe Janet can weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, Janet, if you would like to join the conversation, you're very welcome to do so. It's been quite a ride trying to find a home for the collection because it's been stored in a basement for decades, and obviously that leaves some marks on the objects and also the paper. So it was quite important to find a permanent home, and it took about 3 or 4 years to finally get the Avery Archives to take the papers, which I think is often based on the fact that if you have archives that include models, you need a lot of space and they need a lot of care, especially if they have to be restored. And many collections are very wary of taking on such a responsibility, especially if there's so many. And ultimately, that's also, I think, one of the reasons for why the Avery took everything but the models. And some of the models went to different collections. MoMA has a few. Some models went to the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. So they've been, the collection had to be taken apart a little bit in order to be able to preserve it. But the large bulk of paper, luckily, was preserved by the Avery.
I think the Conrad, ever since he died, or when he died, there was talk about these models, and that's always, as Teresa has said, the real issue with collecting models is they take up so much space. And so it's sort of some of the more important models found homes. And this was coming at the end of Teresa's research and getting her PhD done. And also it was a question of the family, sort of everybody coming to a decision that this was what could happen. And so it was one of the last couple of collections that I took, and we had a truck or something. We ended up going out to the storage unit in Jersey City a couple of times to get that. And fortunately, I had a graduate student who was very interested in it, and he eventually processed the material for a finding aid that's online at Avery Library's Drawings and Archives page, so you can see that. And so it was really interesting to see this stuff, because it's also little bits and pieces of the models left. Is a very different kind of archive to see. And then you just get this incredible record of all of these projects that he worked on and who the architects were. And it's kind of a professional archive in that sense. And then following that, we got the Checkman photographic archive through Teresa's help from Checkman's son, who is a television cameraman of all things, sort of in the family business, but not quite. And then separately, I moved on to Jock Pottle's architectural photography, and he was somebody who had started out with Esto shooting buildings, but have ended up being an architectural model photographer. So the Conrad kind of started a building block of these 3 related collections. So it was a great time to collect things, and Teresa was instrumental with the family, and so it was great. I miss that chase of collections. So in my retirement, it isn't as much fun. So anyway.
Teresa, do you want to comment on that kind of search? We talked before. It's a little bit like Indiana Jones and kind of opening up the tomb or the warehouse of mysteries.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, you know, as a curator who has worked for architectural collections for about 10 years, one of the things I always realize which is very important, is proactively approaching potential donors or people who might have collections, because there's a lot that we don't know that's sitting in someone's basement that might be thrown out when that person dies, or the children don't know what to do with it. And I think that's Conrad is one of the extremely lucky cases where we were able to do that before something happened to it. And I think we were quite close. So it's really thanks to Janet's efforts that this collection still exists.
Yeah, well, yeah, there are so many things out there now. And even as part of when I retired, I still have my pulse on a couple of things that I'm determined that one day will see the light of day in an archive instead of in somebody's storage space. But you also just can't make people give things. I know that in the Conrad family had several family issues with health issues and stuff. And things happen quickly or they don't happen at all. You can't make people give up private property. And sometimes it's just too late, or they don't think about it in time for like an institution to actually, and I think institutionally, because there's so many collections now, institutions have a harder time responding to these last minute requests to donate things, because it's a big responsibility. And I think, reflecting on my career back in the 80s, I think when people started to collect, it was just that first year that I was working, it was the Thomas Lamb collection, Felix Candela, Philip Johnson, and like one more. That's all in 1 year. I mean, things just kind of flew out at you. And now it's kind of, those paper records are receding. And so it is kind of the last effort you can do to get paper records, I think. So.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and then we can also move on, I think it's also the art market that has really changed the way that people look at whatever they find in their basement, because if people end up needing money or worrying about the value of objects, they often try to sell. And I think that makes these collections very inaccessible for public institutions who don't often have those kinds of funds to buy.
And even more perhaps eBay, which monetizes anything that's in the attic or in a collection for people who aren't professionally in the field of trying to interpret this work for historical purposes. And to that point, I wonder if Teresa, you might comment on the business of model making, which, as you know, you've looked at it changing over time and coming up to the present. This certainly is an area that architects rely on and developers rely on in order to communicate and create value of the representation of future buildings. But my question is maybe historical and about New York, because it seems to me that New York may be one of the only places where the industry of the representation of architecture in development, in museum work, in architectural services being located in large corporate firms that began to emerge from the 30s, and then especially in the post-war era, that there wasn't the opportunity to make a business of model making unless you had the resident firms that had the kinds of corporate clients that could turn a lobby into a full-scale 6 or 12-foot model instead of, you know, just a building or a master plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think that's also always, you know, people often, when I was developing the book and I was doing the research, they were always asking, why New York, and why do you think this is so important? And I think you're absolutely right. New York is where most of the new developments happen. You had the big firms, you had the big architectural news organizations. Most of the big magazines were headquartered in New York. You had a lot of international headquarters in and around New York, also Connecticut and New Jersey, so the metropolitan area. And the model makers based in New York had easy access. So Conrad was quite smart in picking Harvey Corbett as his first employer, because that opened up this network that was developing and that ultimately turned out to be these big offices. But when he started out, and not just him and many others, SOM, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, was a tiny company operating out of Chicago, who then had these smaller offices in New York. So the model makers kind of grew up with the offices. As the offices got more jobs and were more popular and had higher commissions, bigger commissions from international clients, the model makers got bigger jobs. So in a way, they kind of raised each other. The model helped the architects sell the design, and in turn, more designs kept coming to the architectural office, which then meant the model maker got more jobs. And I think that's where New York was one of those small centers in the sense that the world of offices and model makers was quite small, and they just kept giving each other jobs. So there's the famous example of Gordon Bunchak, who really liked working with Theodore Conrad, who was his biggest client. But at the same time, Gordon Bunchak also really liked working with Ezra Stoller. So for most of SOM's buildings across the world, the models are made by Conrad and the photos are taken by Ezra Stoller. So they kind of perpetuated each other's careers in many ways.
And I think you argue too that they defined modernism through that kind of symbiotic relationship of the architecture or the representation of the media dissemination of an aesthetic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a very complex issue, but I think one of the easy ways of describing it is the invention of using plexiglass for model makings to represent glass. And you can see that with the first project I showed, the MetLife Tower, which was a design for a glass tower. It would have been a crazy expressionist facade, and the board said, we don't believe that this is feasible. This doesn't look like a design that we can do, and there seems to be too much risk involved. And as soon as you could represent this and you could show your client, this is what it's going to look like, this is the effect you're going to get, this is how it looks from the street, it was a much easier sell. So in a way, the invention of a material, or the use of a material that was new to model making, then helped modernism convince others that modernism was an exciting and good thing to do for corporate headquarters, which were then seen by other corporate boards of directors who were looking to build new headquarters. So in a way, the models really sold the idea of those designs in a way that everyone could understand.
And I see one question, in order for me to be able to read it properly, I'm going to turn my video off for a moment so that I can then peer at and quote from Wallace Miller. I have a question about the business of model making too, specifically the ownership agreements that Conrad made when he was alive. For photographers, the agreements are complex affairs because of the reproducibility of the work. Did Conrad insist on keeping some of the models because he too was concerned about copyright, or did the architects return them to him because they were too difficult to keep?
Thank you, Wallace. Excellent question. I think there's two things here. The easy answer is yes, many architects or the clients returned the models to Conrad because they were big and they didn't know what to do with them. The slightly more complicated answer is that it depended on the contract. So often it depended on who paid for the model. In some cases, like in the case of Edward Ross Stone, he would often pay for the model himself. So the architect paid for the model because he was convinced that the model was so important that he needed it to sell the design to the client. But often what architects would try to do is charge the client for the model. So the client was kind of the default owner, but then the client didn't always want the model. So they returned it or tried to throw it out. And then Conrad said, no, I'll take it, and brought it back. Even more complicated is that often models, especially in the 30s and 40s, that were meant only to be photographed, to be put in magazines and then to sell floor plans of designs, these models would remain with Conrad and were often taken apart and then reused for other models. So the model never really was meant to exist. It was kind of like the Thomas Demand of model making in the 30s and 40s. And as for the copyright, that's a real issue, actually, because Conrad did have a professional stamp that he would put on the backs of model photos. So it said model photographer Louis Checkman, and then there was another stamp that said model maker Theodore Conrad. But the practice was that if a model photo was published in a magazine or a book, the credit went to the model photographer because you had to credit them. And they usually left out the name of the model maker. So there's very few publications that name the model makers. You can tell who it is if you know the kind of model making, but the practice was to give credit to the photographer and not to the model maker.
I have another question about the business of model making and a kind of an alternative model of commercialism, and that is Hollywood. Did Conrad work at all for the movies? Or how was Hollywood a different kind of specialization from model making for architects?
Yeah, so there's again two sides to that. Conrad's models, the ones he kept or he had returned, were kept in storage. So he had a storage unit with many of the very famous models. And he often rented those out for people who needed a model for making movies. There's a very famous movie, and I can never remember the name, from the 80s that has a very noticeable display of his models in the background. But these were architectural models that were rented out as a backdrop in movies. The models made for Hollywood movies, so Blade Runner, the very famous ones where you have models that are being used to create science fiction settings or something else, they were made by model makers operating in Hollywood, and that was a very different trade because a lot of these models are made more like dioramas. So they're not meant to be seen as an object on a pedestal and you have one spotlight on it. They're meant to be illuminated like models that were shown at the New York World's Fair, for instance, like the famous Futurama that had wild scales and distortions that you would never find in an architectural model. So they were never meant as objects in and of themselves, but as things to be objects that were meant to be transformed for the sake of the movie. And as far as I know, there's very few overlaps. The one you find out about when you start looking at World War II and the question of what did all these model makers do is that some of them were sent to the UK because there was a big camouflage operation in the UK that used theatrical model makers. Norman Bell Geddes is a very famous one in the US, but there were many others. And there were some coming from Hollywood that would do this kind of stuff. But as far as I know, there's very little overlap between those model makers because they just cater to very different audiences.
Well, despite my starting late, we have consumed an hour in viewing and thinking about and talking about models. Are there any kind of last comments that you'd like to mention about areas that other scholars might venture into, or what you think the future is for looking either at collecting models or interpreting them? How is it changing now? And you know, what other areas beyond the kind of specialty shop that still certainly exist in the milieu of New York architects and model making?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that we still don't know. We don't know enough about the 20th century, and we don't know enough about the time before. So I think for anyone looking to go into this field, there's a lot to discover. From the Conrad, starting with the Conrad archive and then looking at what's missing there, I would say we don't know enough about the scene of model makers, not even in New York. We have a lot of names, but there's a lot of research that needs to be done to find out whether Conrad really was the biggest model maker. I mean, there's a lot that points in that direction, but you might uncover things that we still don't know. So I think research into the profession of the model maker is there's a lot to do there. But then I think we're also moving along as time moves on, that we should start preserving the work of model makers who started out in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, who are retiring now and who are looking for someone to take their material. And there's quite a few that I'm aware of who are still looking for archives or a permanent home. So I think there's another technological change that happened in the 70s and 80s. You have new materials coming in, styrofoam, the famous blue models that we all know from the 90s from offices that haven't been studied the same way that we've looked at the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. And then finally, I think what is equally important is that we don't only focus on physical models, but now realize we have 3D models that are digital that also require preservation, which is quite tricky and requires a lot of technical knowledge, but which also is a pressing issue because the pioneers of that field who started in the 60s and 70s are also retiring. So there's a lot to do in model making.
Well, we thank you very much, Teresa, for getting us a start on thinking about those issues moving forward. You're right, there's a whole world out there, in a miniature world, but one to which we need to pay more attention for those unnamed authors of so many of the worlds that we encounter in trying to understand architecture and its history through all the contributing crafts that help to create both the illusion and the reality of architecture. So thank you so much for sharing your book with us tonight. And we look forward to hearing much more about your curatorial efforts in the future too.
Thank you.
So thanks, Teresa. Thanks everybody for joining us. See you next time.